5 years old, a birthday party, a bite that takes a piece of a child's skull, with it, a piece of his life. That's the moment most fans think that this story ends. It isn't. What you're about to watch is the complete canon timeline of Five Nights at Freddy's, every confirmed event, in the actual order it happened, not the order the games were released. No padding, no fan theories presented as fact, no skipped reveals. Every theory that comes up will be clearly labeled as exactly that, a theory separate from what's actually confirmed. This is built from the games and the novels, in that order of priority, and where the two disagree, or where something stays genuinely unresolved, that gets called out too. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly how a pizza restaurant mascot became one of the most disturbing horror icons ever created, and exactly how much human tragedy is buried underneath every animatronic suit in this franchise. It starts decades before the first jump scare. It starts with two friends and a workshop. Before the first jump scare, before the animatronics, before a single child went missing, there were two men with a dream and a workshop full of spare parts. To understand why Five Nights at Freddy's became one of the most disturbing horror franchises ever made, you have to go back further than anyone expects. You have to go back to a friendship, a business, and a decision that would poison everything that came after it. This is where it all begins. In the years before any pizzeria opened its doors, two men named William Afton and Henry Emily formed a partnership. They weren't murderers yet. They weren't monsters yet. They were inventors, engineers, men who loved building things that moved, that talked, that seemed almost alive. Together they started a company that would eventually become Fazbear Entertainment. But in these earliest days, it was something smaller and more personal. A shared obsession with bringing machines to life. Henry Emily is often remembered as the more sympathetic of the two, the man who would later spend his life trying to clean up the wreckage his partner left behind. But in the beginning, he was just as invested in the dream. Both men had families. Both men had daughters who grew up surrounded by the animatronic prototypes their fathers built. Henry had a daughter named Charlotte, who everyone called Charlie. William had children too, including a daughter named Elizabeth and two sons, one of whom history would come to know simply as the Crying Child, because his real name was withheld from players for years. These children weren't just bystanders to their father's work. They grew up inside it. They played among half-finished animatronic suits. They knew the workshop the way other kids knew a backyard. And this closeness, this intimacy in innocent children and increasingly unstable machines, is the seed that the entire timeline grows from. The first location to open under this partnership wasn't the pizzeria most fans picture when they hear the name Freddy Fazbear. It was a smaller, quieter establishment called Fredbear's Family Diner. The mascot here was a golden-colored bear named Fredbear, paired with a yellow rabbit suit called Spring Bonnie. These two suits matter more than almost anything else in the franchise, because they aren't ordinary animatronics. They're spring-locked suits, hybrid machines that can also be worn like a costume, with an animatronic endoskeleton folded inside springs and latches under the fabric. This detail seems small now, but it will become one of the most important mechanical facts in the entire series, because these particular suits are designed in a way that makes them lethal if anything goes wrong with their internal springs. Remember that detail. It will come back. Fredbear's Family Diner is where the franchise's very first tragedy occurs, and it happens to Henry's daughter, Charlie. The exact details of her death are presented through the novels rather than the games, told in a softened, almost fairy tale register, but the core fact is brutal and clear. Charlie dies on the property, and the man responsible is William Afton. This isn't a theory. This is foundational canon, confirmed across both the novel trilogy and later crossover material that folded this story into the same universe as the games. Charlie's death is the original sin of the entire timeline. It happens before the more famous murders players read about in the first game. It happens before the bite that fans argue about online. It is, chronologically, the first child Afton kills, and it sets a pattern that will repeat with horrifying consistency for years. Henry doesn't know the truth right away. For a long time, he believes his daughter's death was an accident, a malfunction, a tragedy without a villain. This single misunderstanding will define the rest of his life. Years later, when he finally learns what really happened, that knowledge will drive nearly every decision he makes for the remainder of the timeline, including the final, fiery choice that ends the saga decades down the road. But that's a story for much later. Right now, all you need to understand is this: Henry built these animatronics out of love, and one of them was used to take his daughter's life by his own business partner. William Afton's family was not spared from his nature either. While the diner continued operating, his own children remained close to the workshop and its suits. His daughter Elizabeth had a particular fascination with one prototype in this same lineage, a small animatronic that would later evolve into something called Circus Baby. Elizabeth's story technically belongs more to a later chapter chronologically, since her death happens at a different, more advanced facility his company builds afterward. But it's worth planting here because it establishes something crucial about William Afton as a person. He wasn't a man who lost control once, in one terrible moment. He was a man surrounded by warning signs, surrounded by deaths connected to his own creations, who kept building anyway. Then there's his son, the boy fans call the crying child. Of all the tragedies that open this franchise, his is the one most players actually witness firsthand, because his story is the entire plot of Five Nights at Freddy's 4. For years, fans assumed that game was happening in real time, a child barricaded in his bedroom fighting off nightmare versions of the animatronics. The truth, confirmed through later context and item interactions within the game itself, is much sadder. FNAF 4 isn't real, it's a fever dream. It's the final, dying hallucinations of a child lying in a hospital bed, his mind replaying fear and trauma as his body shuts down. The nightmare Fredbear and his nightmare friends aren't monsters breaking into a house. They're a child's sight processing the worst day of his life as he slips away. And that worst day has a name fans have given it, even though the games themselves use it sparingly: the bite of 83. At Fredbear's family diner, the crying child becomes the target of bullying, including from his own older brother, Michael. In one particularly cruel moment, during what should have been a birthday celebration, the older kids force him toward the animatronic stage, specifically toward Fredbear, as a prank. Children at the time genuinely believed, encouraged by adult assurances, that the animatronics were perfectly safe, that nothing could go wrong with how the spring-locked mechanisms worked. They were wrong. The Fredbear suit bites down on the child's head. The injury is severe enough that the boy is hospitalized, and based on everything FNAF 4 shows us about his declining mental and physical state, it is implied that this injury is what eventually leads to his death. This is the bite of 83, and it's distinct from a second, less severe biting incident that happens years later at a different location, one fans call the bite of 87, which we'll cover when we reach that chronological point. Keeping these two incidents separate is one of the first things any newcomer needs to lock into their understanding of this timeline, because confusing them is one of the most common mistakes people make when they're first learning this lore. So by the end of this earliest period in the timeline, before a single pizzeria most fans recognize has even opened, the human cost is already staggering. Charlie, Henry's daughter, is dead because of William. The crying child is dying or already dead because of an accident born from bullying and a faulty animatronic. And William Afton's own daughter Elizabeth is on a path that will end the same way, just at a later facility we haven't reached yet. Two families, bound together by a shared business and a shared love of building lifelike machines, are already being torn apart by the very thing that brought them together. And Henry, the man who still doesn't fully understand what his partner has done, keeps building, keeps designing, keeps believing that the next animatronic, the next location, the next innovation might somehow be different. It won't be. What comes next is the event most fans actually picture when they hear the name Five Nights at Freddy's for the first time. The opening of the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and the disappearance of 5 more children whose unfinished, unjust deaths will animate the entire rest of the series, quite literally. But none of that horror works, none it lands the way it's meant to, unless you understand what we just covered. The animatronics were never just monsters. They were built by a grieving father and a man who had already proven, more than once, that he was capable of using these machines to do something unforgivable. That's where we're headed next. Five Nights at Freddy's begins, for most players, in a single room. A security guard, a desk, a handful of cameras, and animatronics that seem just a little too aware of their surroundings. But by now you already know this story didn't start there. It started years earlier, in a smaller diner with a bite that changed everything. This chapter picks up exactly where that bite leaves off, and it's where the franchise's first true horror takes shape. The bite of '83 left William Afton's youngest son hospitalized, and according to everything Five Nights 4 shows us through its dream logic structure, his condition only worsens from there. The game itself is the boy's mind in its final hours, replaying fear, guilt, and isolation as nightmare versions of Fredbear and his friends close in around a bedroom that may not even be real anymore. It's heartbreaking precisely because it's so quiet. No jump scares from a corporate mascot in a pizzeria. Just a dying child, alone, processing trauma his family never adequately addressed. By the time this chapter of his life ends, the crying child is gone, and Fredbear's family diner, already haunted by Charlie's death, carries the weight of a second child lost to the same business. You'd think a tragedy like that would end things. It doesn't. Fredbear's family diner closes, but the partnership between William Afton and Henry Emily doesn't dissolve. Instead, it evolves into something bigger. The diner concept is retired, and in its place rises Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a new restaurant built around a new mascot lineup. Freddy Fazbear himself, Bonnie the rabbit, Chica the chicken, and Foxy the pirate fox. This is the lineup most people picture when they think of this franchise, and this is the location where the series' most infamous crime takes place. 1985. A man in a security guard uniform, or sometimes simply an employee with after-hours access, walks freely through Freddy Fazbear's Pizza in a purple shirt. He approaches 5 children, one at a time, often using a Freddy Fazbear suit as a lure, the kind of trusted, friendly face no child would think to run from. He kills them. All 5. Their bodies are hidden inside the building, and their deaths are covered up so thoroughly that the public never learns what really happened to them. This man is William Afton. Players and fans call him Purple Guy, a nickname born from his pixelated color palette in the original game's minigames, but make no mistake, this is the same man from the diner, the same business partner Henry trusted, the same father whose own children had already been harmed by the machines he built. The murders are revealed gradually, almost accidentally, through small 8-bit minigames that appear between nights if the player survives long enough. These minigames are not flavor text, they are the actual narrative backbone of the entire original game, told in a deliberately obscured, almost mythological way, forcing players to piece together what really happened the same way investigators in the game's own universe eventually do. Here's the detail that turns this from a tragic crime into a supernatural horror story. The 5 murdered children don't simply disappear into the building's walls and stay silent. Their spirits don't move on. Instead, something about the location, perhaps something about the proximity to their own corpses, allows them to possess the only things nearby capable of holding them: the animatronics themselves. Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy become vessels for the murdered children's souls, and these souls are not at peace. Angry, confused, and fixated on the idea of justice, even if their understanding of how to achieve it is stirred by trauma and grief into something monstrous. This is why, in the original game, the animatronics roam the restaurant at night, converge on the security guard's office. It's not random malfunction. It's not a glitch in their programming. It's possessed children, drawn toward an adult male figure during the only hours they're active, driven by some warped instinct connected to what happened to them. The player character, working the night shift purely for a paycheck, has unknowingly stepped into the middle of a haunting born from an unsolved mass murder. There's a 6th animatronic too, one that doesn't appear consistently and seems to glitch in out of existence. Golden Freddy. For years, this character was one of the franchise's most debated mysteries. Later games and supplementary material connect Golden Freddy directly back to the crying child from the previous chapter, suggesting his spirit, too, ended up tied to this same haunted lineage of suits, separate from the 5 murdered at this specific location, but bound to the same supernatural rules. Buried within the minigames is a phrase that becomes one of the franchise's most quoted pieces of dialogue. After completing a particular sequence, a message appears reading simply, "It's me." Fans have spent years debating exactly who is speaking and what it means, since the phrase appears in a context tied to the Purple Guy character himself. While some ambiguity remains around its precise implications, the consistent interpretation, supported by William Afton's confirmed identity as the killer, is that this is the closest the original game comes to a direct confession, a chilling, almost taunting acknowledgement from the murderer himself. The restaurant doesn't survive this. Word eventually spreads, the smell of decay reportedly becomes impossible to ignore, and the establishment is shut down by health and safety violations layered on top of the unresolved disappearances. But closing the doors doesn't end the haunting, and it doesn't end William Afton's involvement with these machines either. One more incident deserves mention here, because it's frequently confused with the Bite of 83, and untangling the two is essential for understanding this timeline correctly. Sometime during this same general era, a separate biting incident occurs, this time involving an employee named Fritz Smith and one of the animatronics widely believed to be Foxy. This event becomes known among fans as the Bite of 87. Unlike the Bite of 83, this incident doesn't carry the same deep emotional weight in terms of family tragedy, but it's referenced enough in supplementary material and Easter eggs that it's worth knowing as its own distinct event years after the original Bite and at a different stage of the timeline. Mixing these two incidents up is one of the easiest ways to get lost in this story, so keep them firmly separated in your mind as we continue. By the end of this chapter, the picture of William Afton has fully crystallized. This isn't a man who snapped once. This is a man responsible for at least 6 dead children now, counting Charlie, the crying child, and the 5 victims of the pizzeria murders. And he has done all of this while continuing to operate within the same company, alongside a partner who still doesn't fully grasp what he's capable of. The animatronics that once represented childhood joy and entertainment have become something else entirely. Containers for grief, rage, and unfinished justice, animated each night by the very souls Afton extinguished. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza closes its doors, but William Afton isn't finished. Not even close. His company is already moving forward with new technology, new locations, and new ambitions, and somewhere in that expansion, his own daughter Elizabeth is about to become his next victim, in a facility built specifically around the kind of animatronic she always loved most. That story comes next. If the last chapter ended with William Afton's body count rising into the double digits between his own children and the 5 souls trapped in those original animatronics, this next part of the story might be the hardest to sit with, because this time, the victim isn't a stranger lured into a restaurant after hours. This time, and the animatronic responsible for her death is one specifically designed and built by her father's own company. Her name was Elizabeth Afton, and to understand what happens to her, you first need to understand the direction William Afton's business was heading during this period. While Freddy Fazbear's Pizza had been a public-facing restaurant, full of mascots meant to entertain birthday parties and families, Afton Robotics, the manufacturing side of the operation, was experimenting with a different category of animatronic altogether. These were smaller, more elaborate, more technologically advanced machines, eventually known as the Funtime line. Bright colors, cheerful music, an almost theatrical flair. Among the earliest and most important of these creations was a small animatronic ballerina-style performer named Circus Baby. Elizabeth loved Baby. By every account given through the franchise's storytelling, she was drawn to this particular animatronic the way a lot of children become attached to one specific toy out of an entire collection. Except in her case, the toy could talk back, sing, interact with her directly, because that's exactly what Baby was engineered to do. Unfortunately, what Elizabeth didn't know, and what her father either failed to anticipate, or more disturbingly, may have known and ignored, was that something inside Baby's design was capable of acting independently and dangerously. The exact mechanism is left intentionally unsettling, rather than fully explained. Baby, through some combination of her internal systems and what later lore suggests may be an early experimental AI component, lures Elizabeth in using an ice cream dispensing mechanism built into her design, a feature meant to delight children during normal operation. Instead, the mechanism activates in a way that causes Elizabeth's death. It's a horrifying inversion of everything the animatronic was supposed to represent. A machine built to charm and entertain children becomes the instrument of a child's death. And not just any child. The daughter of the very man who approved its construction. This single event becomes the foundation for the franchise's eventual exploration of Afton Robotics' most advanced and most disturbing facility. An underground complex built specifically to manufacture, test, and distribute these funtime animatronics on a larger scale. While the full story of that facility unfolds later, in the time, once Elizabeth's older brother Michael becomes involved, it's important to plant the seed here, because everything that happens in that facility traces directly back to this moment. Baby doesn't start as a malevolent entity built for revenge. She starts as something built for joy, twisted by circumstance, tragedy, and possibly her father's own negligence into something else entirely. There's a deeper layer to this that becomes clear only once you step back and look at the pattern forming across William Afton's life. Charlie, killed by an animatronic her father didn't even build. The crying child, injured and ultimately killed by a malfunctioning suit at a diner Afton co-owned. 5 more children, murdered directly by Afton's own hands using a Freddy Fazbear suit as a lure. And now Elizabeth, his own daughter, killed by a machine built by his own company. A piece of technology he personally would have overseen, tested, and approved. At what point does an accident stop being an accident? At what point does a man surrounded by this many tragedies, all connected to the same business, the same machines, the same warped relationship between innocence and engineering, become something other than an unlucky bystander to his own life? The franchise never asks this question directly through dialogue, but it's impossible to watch this pattern unfold chronologically and not arrive at the answer yourself. William Afton isn't cursed. He's the cause. What makes Elizabeth's death especially significant for the rest of the timeline isn't just the tragedy itself, but what happens to her afterward, because by this point in the story, a disturbing rule has already been established. Children who die in connection to these animatronics don't simply pass on. Something about the combination of trauma, unfinished life, and proximity to these machines allows their consciousness, their spirit, to persist inside the technology itself. We saw this with the 5 children possessing Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. We saw a version of it with the crying child's connection to Golden Freddy. And now, Elizabeth's spirit becomes bound to Circus Bee herself, the very animatronic responsible for her death. This creates one of the more psychologically tangled relationships in the entire franchise. Baby isn't simply a possessed shell anymore, the way the original 4 animatronics were straightforward vessels for outside victims. Baby becomes something closer to a fusion, an animatronic whose original AI and whose newly trapped child spirit exist in some uneasy, blurred coexistence. Later material suggests Baby's underlying intelligence is manipulative and self-aware in ways that go beyond simple haunting, hinting that part of what makes her dangerous isn't just Elizabeth's trapped spirit, but something inherent to the system Afton Robotics built into her from the start. Whether that original system was always dangerous, or whether grief and trauma corrupted it the same way it corrupted the other animatronics, remains one of the timeline's more debated points. And it's worth flagging clearly as an area where the games leave room for interpretation rather than confirmed fact. What isn't up for debate is what this means moving forward. William Afton's company now has, quite literally, built the technology and the facility that will define the next major chapter of this story. An underground complex, designed around these funtime animatronics, eventually becomes the setting where Afton's son Michael goes searching for answers about his father, where baby's true nature finally surfaces in full, and where an even more dangerous entity, born from the wreckage of everything Afton built, comes into existence for the first time. But that facility, and everything inside it, only makes sense you understand what we just covered. Elizabeth wasn't a footnote. She wasn't background lore dropped into a sequel to add shock value. She was the direct, devastating result of a father who kept building dangerous machines even after he had already proven, more than once, exactly what those machines were capable of doing to the people closest to him. By the end of this earliest period in the timeline, the human cost connected to William Afton now includes Charlie, the crying child, the 5 victims from the original pizzeria, and his own daughter Elizabeth. Five Nights at Freddy's hasn't even reached its main public restaurant story yet in full, the one most casual fans remember first, and already the foundation beneath it is built almost entirely out of grief. Henry Emily, still believing for years some of this was accident rather than intention, continues his work alongside Afton. And Michael, Elizabeth's older brother, the same boy who once bullied his younger sibling into that fateful encounter with Fredbear, is about to step directly into the aftermath of his father's creations in a facility built deep underground, where his sister's spirit now resides inside a machine, designed to look like a friend. That's where we're headed next. The original restaurant is gone, sealed shut after the murders, the smell of decay, and a body count that quietly destroyed William Afton's first company under that name. But Fazbear Entertainment doesn't disappear with it. A new location opens, one most fans don't realize is actually older in the game's internal timeline than it first appears, which sounds like a contradiction until you understand how the second game's story is actually structured. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 introduces a brand new building, brighter, more modern, packed with updated animatronics. There's Toy Freddy, Toy Bonnie, Toy Chica, a strange fox-shaped animatronic called Mangle who appears to be in a constant state of disrepair, and a small balloon-carrying character named Balloon Boy. For years, this location came after the original pizzeria. The opposite is true. This restaurant, despite being numbered second in release order, takes place chronologically before the murders of Chapter 2, before the original Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy ever became possessed. The man working the phone in this game, the voice players here giving advice and context across the nights, is a character fans call Phone Guy, and he's not just exposition. He's an employee at this very location, and his fate becomes one of this chapter's most important confirmed details. Partway through the game, his in-universe recorded messages cut off mid-sentence, implying something violent happens to him during a night shift. Later material confirms what that implication suggests. Phone Guy doesn't simply quit or get reassigned. He's killed, his body stuffed inside one of the facility's spare animatronic suits, a fate that becomes grimly relevant once you understand who's responsible. That responsibility traces back to the same man at the center of everything so far. William Afton, still operating within his own company during this period, is the one who commits this murder, continuing a pattern that, by this point in the timeline, should surprise no one. But Phone Guy isn't the only victim connected to this location. The game's hidden minigames, structured similarly to the ones in the original title, reveal that Afton lures and kills several more children here too, using the same method that's worked for him, a trusted mascot suit as bait. This is where the franchise complicates its own mascot mythology even further. The new, brightly colored toy animatronics at this location are equipped with facial recognition software, ironically installed as a safety measure to help avoid accidentally harming children. The unintended side effect is that these same animatronics begin reacting with hostility toward adults, specifically adult men, during night hours, a malfunction that becomes especially convenient once you realize children's spirits, murdered at this very location, are the ones now influencing the toy animatronics' behavior after dark. After the murders at this second location are eventually discovered, or at least suspected strongly enough to shut things down, the older, withered, original-style Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy models, the same ones already possessed from Chap 2's murders, are brought out of storage, reintroduced into this facility temporarily, operating alongside the newer toy models during the same period covered by this game. This explains one of the more confusing structural elements for newcomers: why Five Nights at Freddy's 2 features both old and new animatronic designs simultaneously, despite seeming to take place chronologically before the original Pizzeria's own murders fully play out. The withered models are leftover technology from the diner era and from early Freddy Fazbear's pizza prototypes, reused here before the building most fans recognize as the original location is even fully established as its own standalone restaurant. It's worth being direct about something here, because this is one of the more genuinely parts of official canon. The exact chronological relationship between this second pizzeria and the original murders covered in Chapter 2 has shifted slightly across different official statements over the years, and fan consensus on the precise order of certain overlapping details isn't unanimous. What remains solid and confirmed across all versions of this explanation is the core sequence: Phone Guy's death, several more child murders connected to William Afton, the facial recognition malfunction, and the eventual closure of this location, all of which deepen the body count and further establish Afton's pattern before his temporary defeat in the chapter that follows. By the end of this period, Afton has once again gotten away with murder, this time including an adult employee in addition to more children. The company, built originally on a friendship between two engineers, now has two separate locations tainted by mass death, and the original 4 animatronics, withered and reused, carry their possessed occupants directly into this second restaurant's final, chaotic nights. It's during this same general window of time, with the possessed spirits now fully aware of exactly who's responsible for everything that's happened to them, that they finally get the chance to act on it. They corner Afton. And as covered in the chapters that follow this one, that confrontation sends him fleeing into the one place he thinks might protect him: an old, spring-locked Spring Bonnie suit, setting in motion the mechanical betrayal that very nearly ends his story for good. Somewhere beneath the surface, far from any public storefront, William Afton's company built something it never advertised. No sign on a highway, no birthday party flyers, no smiling mascot greeting families at the door. This facility existed for one purpose: research, testing, and manufacturing of the next generation of animatronics. And it's here, in this sealed-off underground complex, that the story of Michael Afton, William's surviving son, truly begins. By this point in the timeline, Michael has lived for years under the weight of his family's collapse. His younger brother died after the '83, an incident Michael himself was partially responsible for setting in motion through childhood bullying. His younger sister Elizabeth died inside this very company's technology, devoured by a machine called Circus Baby, that was supposed to bring her joy. His father disappeared from public life, and the rumors swirling around him, murder, disappearances, a man in a purple shirt, never fully went away. Michael grew up in the wreckage of all of it, and at some point he decides he's done waiting for answers. He goes looking for his father directly. This is where Five Nights at Freddy's sister location begins, although the game never states Michael's identity outright. It calls him simply the Technician, a new night shift employee taking a position at a remote facility called Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental. Players spend years debating who this silent protagonist actually is, and later material, including direct statements outside the games themselves, confirms what many fans suspected. This is Michael Afton, using the job as a cover to dig into what really happened to his sister, and by extension to find his missing father. The facility itself operates almost like a theme park ride crossed with a corporate testing lab. Each night, the technician is guided through different sections of the underground complex by an AI voice, ostensibly performing simple maintenance tasks, but almost immediately, something feels wrong. The animatronics here, branded as the Funtime line, are more advanced and more unsettling than anything seen in the earlier pizzerias. There's Funtime Freddy, paired with a small puppet-like companion called Bon Bon. There's Funtime Foxy, later revealed in supplementary material to be the animatronic known as Mangle from the second pizzeria, repurposed and reintroduced here. And presiding over the entire facility is the one piece of technology this whole location was built around: Circus Baby. This is the same baby introduced in the previous chapter, the animatronic responsible for Elizabeth Afton's death. Except here, fully active, and given a voice, for the first time, Baby reveals herself to be far more calculating than anything the technician expected. She speaks directly to the player throughout the night, offering guidance, warnings, and information that often contradicts what the facility's main system, a controlling AI presence, is telling him. It becomes clear early on that something inside this complex is manipulating events from the shadows, orchestrating circumstances to trap the technician rather than simply employ him. The deeper Michael goes into the facility, the clearer the picture becomes. Baby isn't simply malfunctioning, she's executing a plan. Her ultimate goal, pieced together through the game's events and confirmed in later lore, involves scooping out a human body, using a mechanism within the facility chillingly referred to as the scooper, in order to create a vessel that her consciousness and the combined consciousness of the other, Funtime animatronics, can use to escape the underground facility and exist in the outside world. The technician becomes the target of this plan. Toward the end of the game, after a fire breaks out in the facility's auditorium, the various Funtime animatronics, having shed their outer shells, combine their endoskeletons together into a single grotesque amalgamation of wires, parts, and synthetic skin pulled from the facility's animatronic mascots. This combined entity becomes known to fans as Ennard, and Ennard's plan is exactly what Baby intended from the start. Using Michael's own body as a disguise, Ennard climbs inside him, piloting him like a puppet, to wear his body out of the facility and into the world beyond. For a period of time after this, Michael survives, but not as himself in any meaningful sense. He becomes a host, his body controlled from within by the combined will of Ennard, the same entity formed from his sister's animatronic remains and the other Funtime machines. Eventually, Ennard abandons the body once it begins to decay from the inside, having served its purpose of getting them out of the underground facility. What's left of Michael afterward, alive but profoundly changed by everything that happened to him, becomes a quietly devastating thread the franchise picks up again later. Once he resurfaces with a new identity and a singular purpose, tracking down his father once for all, this time using lessons learned from watching firsthand exactly how far these animatronics, and the people who built them, were willing to go. It's worth pausing here to recognize what this chapter actually represents within the larger structure of the timeline. Sister Location isn't just another haunted location added to the list. It's the chapter where the Afton family's private tragedy and the franchise's public horror finally merge completely. Elizabeth's death, covered in the previous chapter, wasn't an isolated incident confined to a home or a single malfunctioning toy. It was the origin point for an entire underground operation that her own father built, an operation her brother would later walk into, unknowingly stepping directly into the machinery built from his sister's death. There's also a quieter, more unsettling implication buried in this chapter that becomes important later. William Afton himself is conspicuously absent throughout Sister Location. He doesn't appear, doesn't speak, isn't directly confirmed to be present in the facility during these events. Yet his fingerprints are on every piece of technology involved. He approved the designs. He built the systems that made manipulation like Baby's possible in the first place. Whether or not he was physically present underground during these specific nights, his decisions, his negligence, and his pattern of building dangerous machines despite repeated tragedy are the reason any of this was even possible. By the end of this chapter, Michael Afton has lost his body to the very technology his family's company created. His sister's trapped consciousness has played a direct role in that loss, and an entirely new, Combined entity born from years of Afton robotics, unchecked ambition, now exists somewhere in the world, no longer confined to one underground facility. Meanwhile, the original site of the very first murders, the burned-out remains of the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, hasn't stayed quiet either. Word has gotten out, in the strange way these things do, that the old building is supposedly haunted. And somewhere, a new business venture is forming around that rumor, one that will drag William Afton's abandoned, spring-locked body directly back into the light. That's where we're headed next. To understand what happens in this chapter, you need to rewind slightly, back to a moment that technically occurs years before Sister Location, though its consequences ripple forward into everything we just covered. While Michael was being consumed by Ennard underground, the man responsible for starting this entire chain of tragedy was facing a reckoning of his own, one that'd been building since the very first murders at the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. After that restaurant shut down, its animatronics, Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, sat abandoned, but they weren't forgotten by the 5 children whose spirits remained trapped inside them, possessed by murdered souls who never received justice. These animatronics retained a singular, fixated purpose, the same instinct that drove them to corner the security guard during the original game's nightly shifts. They wanted the man responsible. They wanted William Afton. At some point, after the restaurant's closure, Afton returns to the original location. Why he goes back is left somewhat open to interpretation, though the most consistent explanation across the franchise's storytelling is unsettlingly simple. He goes back to destroy the evidence of what he did, specifically the suits and animatronics that contain the lingering proof in whatever spiritual or supernatural sense applies here of his crimes. He's not expecting a confrontation. He's expecting an empty, abandoned building. He's wrong. The 5 possessed animatronics, finally given the opportunity they've been waiting for since their deaths, corner Afton inside the building. In a moment of desperation, looking for anywhere to hide or any way to protect himself, he climbs inside one of the old spring-locked suits left over from his very first venture with Henry, the Golden Rabbit suit, known as Spring Bonnie, the same model of suit, alongside Fredbear, that started this entire timeline back at the diner. This decision is the moment the franchise's most disturbing mechanical detail, introduced all the way back in Chapter 1, finally pays off. Spring-locked suits aren't safe to wear. They're built with an animatronic endoskeleton folded inside springs and latches designed to hold the suit's shape, and those springs are never meant to bear the weight or movement of an actual human body from within for an extended period. Afton climbs inside Spring Bonnie believing it will protect him, shield him from the animatronics closing in, and for a moment, it seems to work. The possessed children, whatever drove their pursuit, apparently can't bring themselves to attack him while he wears the same kind of suit, connected to their own deaths, or perhaps they simply lose track of him, hidden as he is inside familiar, trusted machinery. But the suit itself becomes the trap. As Afton remains inside it, the springs and internal mechanisms holding the costume together fail. The locks release. The animatronic frame inside the suit collapses inward, and Afton's body is crushed and impaled by the very springs and components that were supposed to be protecting him. It's a brutal, almost poetically cruel death, the same mechanical flaw that bit a child back at the diner years earlier, now closing in on the man responsible for that incident, and everything that followed it. Crucially, though, this isn't the end of William Afton's story, and this is one of the most important details for understanding everything that comes afterward in the timeline. He doesn't die outright. Later games and supplementary material make clear that Afton survives this injury in some severely diminished, barely alive state. His body fused with the suit's wreckage, kept alive longer than should be physically possible. Whether this prolonged survival is purely a result of his own willpower, some lingering effect of the natural forces already at work in these animatronics, or simply ambiguous body horror the franchise never fully explains, remains one of the timeline's openly acknowledged gray areas. What is confirmed is that his body remains where it falls, trapped inside the ruined Spring Bonnie suit, abandoned within the original restaurant's now sealed walls. The restaurant itself, already shut down following the original murders, closes for good after this. There's no indication anyone even realizes what happened inside, no public knowledge that the disappearances met his own end in the same building where he committed his crimes. The location simply goes quiet, sealed away, left to decay along with everything inside it, including Afton's broken body still fused within the suit's collapsed frame. This silence doesn't last forever, though, and it's worth setting up exactly how it ends, because it directly shapes where this story goes next. Years later, the old building's reputation as the site of unsolved disappearances doesn't vanish along with its closure. If anything, time turns the location into something closer to local legend, the kind of abandoned building rumored to be haunted, attracting exactly the kind of attention that eventually leads someone to consider turning the tragedy itself into a business opportunity. A horror attraction built specifically to capitalize on the building's grim history, with one critical, failed decision behind it: incorporating whatever can still be salvaged from the original structure into the new attraction's design. That decision is what pulls Afton's ruined body, still technically alive within the wreckage of the Spring Bonnie suit, back out into the world. The suit, and the thing still barely surviving inside it, becomes the centerpiece of a new horror experience built directly on top of the trauma of the original murders. Fans have given this version of the character a name that stuck permanently to the franchise's lexicon: Springtrap. It's not an official designation Afton ever uses for himself, but it perfectly captures what he's become: a man permanently caught, springtrapped, inside the consequences of his own crimes, kept alive by mechanisms he himself approved and built, brought back into the light by people who have no idea they're actually putting on display. By the end of this chapter, the man responsible for nearly every death covered so far in this timeline, Charlie, the crying child, Elizabeth, and the 5 children murdered at the original pizzeria, is no longer simply a fugitive hiding from consequences. He's something closer to a ghost trapped in a broken machine, barely alive, sealed away in an abandoned building that the world has started to mythologize without understanding the truth buried inside it. That truth is about to be uncovered again by an entirely new set of people who have no idea what they're walking into. By this point in the timeline, the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza has been closed for years, its windows boarded, its name reduced to a rumor passed around by people who don't fully understand what actually happened inside. But rumors like that don't stay buried forever, especially not in a culture obsessed with horror and true crime. Eventually, someone decides the building's grim reputation is worth turning into a business. That business is Fazbear Frights, the horror attraction, a haunted house-style experience built specifically to capitalize on the legends surrounding the original locations and unsolved disappearances. The owners behind this new venture aren't connected to Henry Emily or what remains of the original Fazbear Entertainment leadership. They're outside investors looking to profit off urban legend, and in pursuit of authenticity, they make a decision that turns out to be catastrophic. They salvage actual remains from the old, condemned building to use as props and set pieces inside their new attraction. Among the wreckage pulled from that sealed-off location is a suit nobody fully understands the history of: a damaged, decayed golden rabbit costume found crumpled in on itself, looking less like a mascot and more like something that's been through unspeakable trauma. They have no idea this is Spring Bonnie. They have no idea a man is still, somehow barely alive inside it. To them, just an unusually well-preserved, suitably creepy piece of set dressing, exactly the kind of disturbing centerpiece a horror attraction wants. This is how William Afton, broken and fused inside his ruined suit since the events of the previous chapter, ends up back in a building spotlight, surrounded by paying customers walking through a maze designed to scare them on purpose. The dramatic irony here is hard to overstate. People are paying money to be frightened by a prop that is, secretly, the actual unresolved horror behind the very legend they came to experience. Players take on the role of a night security guard at this new attraction, a position that exists largely because the location despite being a recently built horror experience, keeps having unexplained technical problems and equipment malfunctions overnight. It doesn't take long for the guard and the player to realize those malfunctions aren't malfunctions at all. The suit recovered from the old building has begun moving on its own after hours, and fans and the game itself eventually confirm exactly what's happening. Afton, despite the severity of his injuries, retains enough animation and awareness within the wreckage to move through the attraction at night, now operating under the name the fandom has permanently attached to him, Springtrap. But Springtrap isn't the only presence active in this building, and this is where the chapter's emotional weight really comes into focus. The same 5 children whose spirits possess the original Freddy, Bonnie Chica, and Foxy animatronics, the ones who chased Afton into the Spring Bonnie suit in the first place, are still present too, in some lingering, weakened form connected to the building itself, rather than to functioning, and not these anymore. Throughout the nights at Fazbear's Fright, the guard be giving strange visual and audio hallucinations, fragments of old animatronics, static-filled images, distorted messages, all of it suggesting these trapped spirits are still nearby, still aware and still fixated on the man hiding inside, the golden suit roaming the halls. The attraction itself eventually catches fire, and this detail matters more than it might seem at first. Some interpretations connect the blaze to Springtrap's increasingly erratic, dangerous activity overnight, while others leave the exact cause deliberately ambiguous. What's confirmed is the outcome. The building burns, destroying Fazbear's Fright entirely, and, crucially, giving the 5 trapped children's spirits one final opportunity to confront the man who killed them, decades after their deaths and years after his. This is where the franchise introduces one of its most important storytelling mechanics, something that becomes a recurring structural element in later games as well. Scattered throughout the nights at Fazbear's Fright, players can find and complete a series of hidden minigames, each one connected to specific children and specific objects tied to their deaths. Completing these minigames in their proper sequence triggers what fans call the game's true ending, a quiet, almost peaceful sequence showing the 5 children's spirits finally achieving form of closure, their unfinished business resolved enough to let them move on from the physical world entirely. This matters enormously for understanding where the timeline goes from here. After years of being trapped, angry, and fixated on revenge against the man who murdered them, displayed through every prior game this series, the original 5 victims finally get something resembling rest. It's one of the only moments in the entire franchise's bleak history where a wrong gets meaningfully, if incompletely, righted. The children don't get their lives back. Nothing in this story pretends that's possible, but they get to stop being trapped, stop being weaponized inside animatronic shells, and finally leave. Afton himself does not share in that resolution. Whatever happens to him during the fire that destroys Fazbear's Fright, the games leave deliberately unclear in the moment, refusing to confirm outright whether he dies here, escapes, or survives in some further diminished state. What is clear, based on what comes immediately after in the timeline, is that this isn't the last time his name, or his ruined body, resurfaces. The suit may burn, the building may collapse, but the man inside, and the company built on top of his crimes, isn't finished yet. Henry Emily, watching all of this unfold from whatever distance he's maintained over the years, is paying closer attention than anyone realizes. He understands, by this point, exactly what his former business partner has done, not just to the 5 children at the original restaurant, but to his own family, including the daughter Henry lost at the very beginning of this story. The fire at Fazbear's Fright doesn't end Henry's involvement in any of this. If anything, it sharpens his resolve toward a final confrontation he's been quietly working toward for years, one designed not just to stop Afton, but to make absolutely certain nothing like this can ever happen again. That confrontation is coming, and when it arrives, it won't be an accident, a malfunction, or a rumor turned into a business venture gone wrong. It will be deliberate, and it will be final. Everything in this timeline has been building toward one night, one location, and one decision made by a man who has spent years quietly absorbing every tragedy his former partner caused. This is the chapter where William Afton's story, and the original generation of this franchise's horror, finally comes to an end, though not in the way most newcomers expect. After Ennard abandoned Michael Afton's body once it began decaying from the inside, Michael doesn't simply disappear from the story. He survives, disfigured and changed, and he spends the time afterward with a single purpose driving him forward: finding his father, ending this once and for all. Using an inheritance left behind through Fazbear Entertainment's collapsed business holdings, Michael opens a brand new pizzeria, on paper a simple restaurant venture, but in reality, a deliberate trap. He knows his father has a pattern of returning to wherever these animatronics end up. He's counting on it. The new restaurant accumulates animatronics from the franchise's entire ruined history, scrap parts and broken machines purchased cheaply, because nobody else wants anything connected to Fazbear Entertainment's tainted reputation anymore. Among the wreckage gathered here are Scrap Baby, what remains of Circus Baby, by extension, Elizabeth's trapped spirit, Molten Freddy, a tangled mass connected back to Ennard's earlier breakdown, and Lefty, an unassuming animatronic that turns out to be the most important machine in the entire building. Players take on the role of this new restaurant's night employee, again not directly named on-screen but confirmed through later material to be Michael Afton himself, working the very location he built specifically to draw his father out of hiding. Across the nights, communications from a mysterious source, eventually revealed to be Henry Emily, guide the player through increasingly strange instructions, building toward something far bigger than a typical shift. On the final night, William Afton, drawn back exactly as Michael anticipated, appears once again, alive in some form despite everything that happened to him at Fazbear's Fright. What follows is one of the more grotesque, body horror-heavy sequences in the franchise's history. Using a mechanism left over from the building's salvaged equipment, similar in function to the scooper from sister location, Afton's remains are mechanically processed, an act that produces Scrap Trap, yet another diminished, decaying form of the same man, who has now survived multiple supposed deaths across this timeline. But this time, something is different, and it's the detail that finally brings this entire saga full circle. Lefty, the unassuming animatronic gathered among the restaurant's salvage, isn't just spare parts. Henry Emily, the man who has spent the better part of his adult life mourning a daughter he didn't understand the truth about until far too late, has been planning this moment for years. Inside Lefty resides the spirit of Henry's own daughter, Charlie, the very first child killed all the way back in Chapter 1, brought back into the story specifically for this final confrontation. Henry reveals himself directly to the player and to Afton in this closing sequence. He's not interested in escape, revenge through violence, or further confrontation. He's interested in ending the cycle entirely. He locks the building down, traps everyone inside, including all the possessed and partially possessed animatronics still carrying the lingering remnants of murdered children across this story, and sets the entire restaurant on fire, with himself, Afton, and the trapped spirits all inside. This is Henry's final act, and the franchise frames it not as villainy, but as mercy, however brutal that mercy looks in practice. He understands, finally and completely, that the only way to free these trapped souls, the same souls who found partial peace at Fazbear's Fright, but who remain bound, in various diminished forms, to this string of locations, is total destruction. Fire takes the building. Fire takes Afton, in whatever final, confirmed dead state this version of him actually exists in this moment. And fire, according to the game's confirmed good ending, finally releases the lingering spirits trapped across this entire saga, including, implicitly, Henry's own daughter Charlie, who he's now able to let go of completely, decades after first losing her. It's worth being direct. Something here. Some specific details around exactly which spirits are freed, in what order, and the full metaphysical mechanics of how Charlie's spirit ends up vessel-hopping into Lefty across the timeline, blend ambiguous game content with clarifying statements made by the franchise's creator outside the games themselves. The core sequence, Henry's deliberate fire, Afton's death within it, and the freeing of trapped souls, is confirmed canon. Some of the more granular connective details sit closer to officially endorsed interpretation than hard, on-screen fact. And it's worth knowing that distinction exists if you go digging deeper into this chapter yourself. By the end of this chapter, the original era of this franchise's story, beginning with two friends in a workshop, and ending with one of them choosing to burn everything down rather than let the horror continue, is finally completely closed. William Afton is dead. Truly dead this time, not trapped in a suit, not diminished and waiting to resurface somewhere else. The 5 children from the original pizzeria, Charlie, and whatever remained of Elizabeth's presence within the salvage technology, are no longer bound to these machines. Michael Afton survives the fire. The games leave his exact final fate afterward deliberately quiet, but his role in this specific story effectively ends here too, his purpose fulfilled. The Afton family, responsible both as victims and through William specifically, as the source of an enormous of suffering across this entire timeline, is finally mostly accounted for. But endings in this franchise rarely stay clean. There's a gap of time after this fire, years where almost thing is confirmed, and when the story resurfaces again, it does so somewhere new, with new technology, a new central location, and a disturbing hint that whatever core of William Afton's consciousness existed isn't quite as finished as that fire suggested. That's where we're headed next. After the fire that closed out the previous chapter, the franchise enters one of its quieter periods, narratively speaking. No new restaurant immediately opens. No new central character steps forward the way Michael or the crying child did earlier in this timeline. Instead, 2 interconnected projects fill in crucial context for what's coming, while deliberately leaving some questions unresolved. The first of these is Ultimate Custom Night, a game built less around traditional horror survival mechanics and more as a kind of victory lap / psychological coda for William Afton himself. The setup is unusual. Every major antagonist from the franchise's history to this point appears together in a single, customizable night, and the framing device suggests this entire experience is happening inside Afton's own mind, a kind of self-inflicted purgatory built from guilt, fear, and the accumulated weight of every horror he's caused. This matters for the timeline because it strongly implies something the franchise never states with complete bluntness elsewhere. William Afton's consciousness persists, in some form, even after his apparent death in the fire from the previous chapter. Whether this is meant literally, a soul trapped in psychological limbo, or more symbolically, a narrative device representing the inescapable nature of his own crimes catching up to him eternally, is left intentionally ambiguous. What's confirmed is that the game exists, that it's framed explicitly as Afton's own mental space, and that the franchise is signaling, even here, that his story doesn't end as cleanly as the fire suggested. The second project, 5 Nights at Freddy's, Help Wanted, takes a different approach. Structured as a virtual reality experience within its own fiction, it compiles recreations of classic levels alongside new environmental storytelling. Much of it delivered through a character called Tape Girl, who guides players through hidden tapes scattered across the experience. These tapes flesh out smaller, connective lore details, but the most important addition Wanted brings to the timeline is something far more significant than nostalgia. The first appearance of a name and a presence that will define the next major era of this story. That name is Vanny. Within Help Wanted's content, players encounter hints of a mysterious figure connected to a strange purple rabbit mask, alongside disturbing signs that someone, or something, is influencing this person from within their own mind. It's intentionally vague here, more atmosphere than explanation, but it's the franchise's first deliberate seed for a storyline, won't fully bloom until the next major console release years later. The implication, confirmed more directly once that next chapter unfolds, is that William Afton's consciousness, or some digital remnant of it, has found a way to persist and spread beyond his physical body entirely, taking root inside someone else's mind through technology connected to this same VR experience. There's a related thread worth flagging here too, sourced more from the Fazbear Frights book anthology than the games directly, involving a corrupted, glitching digital version of Afton, sometimes referred to as Glitchtrap. The exact relationship between Glitchtrap as a concept and Vanny as a person remains one of the more genuinely debated areas of official lore, with some statements treating them as effectively the same ongoing threat, and others drawing slightly more separation between the digital entity and its human host. Rather than presenting one version as definitive, it's worth simply acknowledging here. A corrupted piece of William Afton, in some digital or psychological form, survives the fire from the previous chapter, and it begins working its way into a new vessel during this period, setting up consequences that won't fully surface until much later. What this period collectively establishes, even through its more abstract and experimental storytelling format, is that Afton was never quite as finished as that fire suggested. Whatever burned in the previous chapter, his original mind, his original drive toward harm, found some way to persist. Exactly how is left as one of the timeline's more deliberately unresolved mysteries, more implication than confirmed mechanism. But its existence is clear, and its consequences are about to become the central focus of an entirely new location, an entirely new scale of horror, and an entirely new central character who has no idea what she's about to become entangled in. That's where we're headed next. Before the franchise's story resumes through games again, a substantial amount of connective lore arrives through a different medium entirely. A series of short story anthologies called Fazbear Frights. It's worth being upfront about how this material fits into the broader timeline, because it occupies a slightly different tier of canon than the mainline games. Most stories within these anthology books are self-contained horror tales, original characters, original situations, not directly tied to the Afton family's saga at all. These function more as flavor and tone setting than hard canon, and treating every detail in every story as confirmed fact would be a mistake. However, scattered throughout these anthologies are specific framing device stories and recurring elements that the franchise's creator has confirmed do connect directly to the mainline timeline, and these are the pieces worth focusing on here. The most important of these connective threads involves the corporate side of this story, something the game-focused chapters so far have only touched on briefly. Fazbear Entertainment, despite the catastrophic string of tragedies attached to its name across every previous location, doesn't simply vanish after the fire that closed the previous era. Corporate restructuring, rebranding efforts, and a renewed push to distance the company's public image from its disastrous history all take place during this period, told through framing narration connected to these anthology books rather than through any single game. This is also where the digital remnant of William Afton, introduced as Glitchtrap in the previous chapter, gets meaningfully developed further. Material across these books reinforces the idea that some corrupted piece of Afton's consciousness survived in digital form, embedded within software connected to the same virtual reality technology explored in Help Wanted. The exact technical explanation for how a human consciousness ends up persisting as corrupted code remains one of the framework's intentionally hand-wavy science fiction elements rather than something explained with real-world rigor. And it's fair to flag it as a place where the franchise prioritizes horror atmosphere over hard logical consistency. What these books confirm more solidly is the timeline's next major construction project. In the years following the previous era's collapse, Fazbear Entertainment, rebuilt and rebranded, begins developing something far larger and more ambitious than any single restaurant covered so far. A massive entertainment complex combining multiple attractions, performance venues, and animatronic shows under one roof. This location will become known as Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex, and it represents the company's attempt to bury its history under spectacle and scale, a strategy, as you might expect by this point in the story, doesn't end up working out the way its executives hope. A young woman named Vanessa, introduced more directly during this period, becomes connected to the lingering digital remnant of Afton during these years, the exact circumstances of how and why kept deliberately obscured across different pieces of supplementary material. By the time the timeline's next major chapter begins, she's already deeply entangled with this corrupted presence, operating under the influence of what's become known publicly, within both the fandom and increasingly within official lore itself, as the masked identity Vanny. By the end of this connective period, the pieces are fully in place for the franchise's next major console release. A new, massive location exists, eager to put the company's bloody history behind it through scale and modernization. A new central human character, Vanessa, carries within her the lingering digital influence of William Afton himself. And the franchise is about to test, on its biggest stage, whether any amount of corporate rebranding can actually bury something this fundamentally rotten. It can't, and the next chapter proves exactly why. A boy named Gregory sneaks into Freddy Fazbear's mega pizzaplex after hours, not realizing he's about to spend an entire night trapped inside the largest, most ambitious location this franchise has ever built. This is the setup for Five Nights at Freddy's security breach, and it represents a significant structural departure from nearly everything covered so far in this timeline. For the first time, players aren't confined to a single room behind a desk. They're moving freely through an enormous, multi-level complex, being actively hunted rather than simply monitoring cameras from safety. The pizzaplex itself reflects everything established in the previous chapter about Fazbear Entertainment's rebranding ambitions. Multiple distinct sections, a glamorous new lineup of performing animatronics called the Glamrock line, including Glamrock Freddy, Glamrock Chica, Montgomery Gator, and Roxanne Wolf, and an overall aesthetic built specifically to feel nothing like the cramped, dimly lit pizzerias from earlier chapters. It's bigger, brighter, and on the surface, completely disconnected from the horror of William Afton's original crimes. That surface doesn't hold for long. Gregory, locked inside overnight, finds an unexpected ally in Glamrock Freddy, who becomes his primary protector throughout the night, guiding him through the various sections while warning him about a different threat stalking the halls. A masked figure wearing a distinctive rabbit mask. This is Vanny, the character introduced through Help Wanted's environmental storytelling, and developed further through the Fazbear Frights material covered in the previous chapter. Across the course of the night, the full picture of Vanny's situation comes into sharper focus, though the game deliberately maintains some ambiguity around exact mechanics, even while confirming the broad strokes. Vanessa, the same young woman connected to the corrupted digital remnant of William Afton, has been influenced and manipulated by this lingering presence for an extended period, to the point where her actions throughout the pizzaplex are driven, at least in significant part, by Afton's continuing, while operating through. Whether this represents full possession, psychological manipulation that gradually eroded her own autonomy, or some blend of both, is left as one of the more actively interpreted aspects of this chapter, though the underlying confirmed fact that Afton's influence is actively directing dangerous behavior through Vanessa isn't in question. The night builds toward multiple possible outcomes, since Security Breach is structured with several distinct endings depending on player choice, something worth acknowledging directly rather than treating any single ending as the sole definitive outcome. Across these various paths, though, certain core reveals remain consistent. The pizzaplex harbors a hidden, decommissioned section beneath its main areas, and within that hidden space waits something the game's marketing kept deliberately obscured before release: a decayed, hybrid creature called Burntrap. Burntrap represents the physical, reconstituted remnant of William Afton's body, fused once again with damaged animatronic components, evoking the same body horror imagery established all the way back with Springtrap, and continuing through Scraptrap. His appearance here confirms something the previous two chapters had only implied. The digital consciousness operating through Vanny and the physical remains of Afton's body, presumed destroyed in the fire that ended the earlier era, are connected, the same underlying entity expressing itself through two different forms simultaneously, one digital and psychological, one physical and mechanical. The confrontation with Burntrap and the fate of both Gregory and Vanessa varies depending on which ending path a given playthrough follows, ranging from more hopeful outcomes where Gregory escapes and Vanessa shows signs of breaking free of Afton's influence, to darker outcomes that leave both characters' fates considerably more uncertain. Rather than asserting one specific ending as the singular canon outcome, it's most accurate to say the franchise has left this question deliberately open at the game's own level, with subsequent material providing some, though not complete, additional clarity. What is clear by the end of this chapter is the broader thematic, connecting all the way back to Chapter 1. Decades after a friendship between two engineers first soured into tragedy after diners, pizzerias, underground facilities, horror attractions, and one final, deliberate fire meant to end this story for good, William Afton's influence still hasn't fully been extinguished. He persists, fragmented across digital code and physical wreckage, still finding ways to manipulate the people closest to whatever technology his legacy touches. The Mega Pizzaplex, specifically to bury this history under spectacle, instead becomes the site of its most expansive, most ambiguous continuation yet. And in the aftermath, with Vanessa's fate left genuinely uncertain depending on how that night actually concluded, a new investigator arrives at the ruins of the Pizzaplex roughly a year later, determined to find answers the main story left deliberately unresolved. That's where we're headed next. 1 year after the events inside the Mega Pizzaplex, the building doesn't operate as a functioning entertainment complex anymore. It sits partially abandoned, partially repurposed, its more ambitious sections sealed off, and left to decay following whatever exactly happened during Gregory's night inside. Into this wreckage steps a new character, working through what's presented as an augmented reality investigation app sent specifically to document and explore the ruins. This is the framing device behind Five Nights at Freddy's. Security breach, ruin, and the character guiding players through this investigation, referred to in-game primarily through an AI assistant called AI, is eventually revealed to be far more significant to the timeline than a simple investigator. Her name is Cassidy, and her connection to this story runs all the way back to the franchise's earliest chapters in a reveal that retroactively reframes details from Five Nights at Freddy's 1 that fans had debated for years. Cassidy, it's confirmed through this content, was one of the 5 children murdered at the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, the same group of victims covered back in Chapter 2. Specifically, material connected to this release identifies her as the spirit originally tied to Golden Freddy, adding a name and fuller identity to a character who had existed in the fandom's understanding for years primarily as a glitch-like mystery rather than a fully realized victim. This doesn't retcon anything established earlier so much as it completes a picture that the franchise had deliberately left incomplete for a very long time. Cassidy's specific motivations driving the ruin investigation tied directly back to Vanessa, the character left in deliberately uncertain circumstances at the end of the previous chapter. Without asserting a single definitive answer to what exactly happened to Vanessa during security breaches events. Since the base game's branching endings keep that question genuinely open, Ruin's content makes Cassidy's spirit is specifically invested in uncovering the truth and, in some interpretations, in offering some form of protection or resolution connected to Vanessa's fate. The investigation itself uncovers a new, dangerous presence lurking within the Pizzaplex's ruins, distinct from anything connected directly to William Afton's consciousness. This is the Mimic, an animatronic AI system with the ability to copy voices, mimic other characters, and manipulate its environment in ways that initially fuse players into assuming they're dealing with familiar threats from earlier in the story. The Mimic's full nature and origin within the Pizzaplex's technology stack is one of the more genuinely unresolved, going into this point in the timeline, deliberately positioned by the franchise as a new, semi-independent danger rather than simply another extension of Afton's ongoing influence. This distinction matters for understanding where the overall story stands by this point. Not every horror left active within this timeline traces back to William Afton anymore. The Pizzaplex's own internal systems, built with enough independent complexity and ambition, have apparently generated dangers of their own, suggesting the franchise's central threat is broadening beyond one family's tragic history into something closer to systemic, technological horror that's outgrown its original architect. By the end of Ruin, players have gained a fuller, named identity for one of the franchise's oldest lingering mysteries in Cassidy, deepened the uncertainty around Vanessa's ultimate fate rather than fully resolving it, and been introduced to a new, distinctly separate threat in the mimic that carries implications for whatever comes next in this story. It's a chapter that adds significant clarity to old questions while deliberately opening new ones, consistent with this franchise's long-standing tendency to never fully close every door it opens. The most recently confirmed major addition to this timeline arrives through a different format than most of what's come before. A book, paired with an accompanying short film adaptation, called Into the Pit, set against the backdrop of the franchise's ongoing print canon. This story introduces a central character named Oswald, who encounters a mysterious mirror-based attraction at one of the franchise's pizzeria locations, one that turns out to allow a form of time travel between different points in this timeline's history. Without spoiling the specific narrative details of how this mechanism functions, since this remains genuinely recent, actively discussed canon at the time of this video's release, the broad significance for the overall timeline is this. Into the Pit directly connects a present-day character to events and figures from William Afton's earlier history, reinforcing just how far-reaching and persistent the consequences of those original decisions, made decades earlier back in Chapter 1, continue to be felt throughout every subsequent era of this story. This material also ties into the franchise's growing theatrical presence, following the success of the first feature film adaptation, with ongoing development continuing to expand this universe across mediums simultaneously. Because represents the most current edge of confirmed canon as of this video, it's worth being especially direct about something. Some of the broader implications and connections suggested by this material remain in active discussion within the fan community without full, definitive clarification from official sources on every detail. Where that's the case throughout this section, treat it as the most recent confirmed information available, rather than a fully closed chapter the way most of this timeline's earlier history has become. What's clear is that the franchise has no intention of fully closing its story. Decades after two friends opened a small diner together, after dozens of confirmed deaths, after fires meant to end this story for good, and after corporate rebrands meant to bury its history, Five Nights at Freddy's keeps finding new ways to extend its central mystery forward, while still treating its foundational tragedy, William Afton's decisions and the devastation they caused across an entire extended family and dozens innocent children, as the gravitational center everything else continues to orbit. Let's pull this entire story back together, start to finish in order. It begins with William Afton and Henry Emily, partners, in a small business built on a shared love of animatronic engineering. Their daughters, Charlie and Elizabeth, and Afton's sons, Michael and the boy fans call the crying child, grow up surrounded by this technology. Charlie dies first, killed by William Afton at Fredbear's family diner, the original sin of this entire timeline. Shortly after, the crying child suffers the bite of 83, a result of bullying gone catastrophically wrong, eventually dying from his injuries, his dying mind forming the entire basis of Five Nights at Freddy's 4. The business evolves into Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, where William Afton murders 5 more children, using a trusted mascot suit to lure them, their spirits becoming trapped inside the restaurant's Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy animatronics. A second pizzeria opens, chronologically overlapping with this period, where Afton kills an employee known as Phone Guy along with additional children, before the original possessed animatronics finally corner him. Meanwhile, Afton's own daughter Elizabeth dies at the hands of Circus Baby, an animatronic built by her father's own company, her spirit becoming trapped within that same machine. This leads directly into sister location, where Michael Afton, searching for his missing father, loses his own body to Ennard, a combined entity formed from Baby and the other Funtime animatronics. Cornered by the spirits of his original victims, William Afton hides inside the Spring Bonnie suit, which crushes and nearly kills him through its own internal spring-lock mechanism, though he survives in a severely diminished state. Years later, his body is unknowingly salvaged for use in Fazbear's Fright, a horror attraction built on top of his crimes, where he becomes known as Springtrap. A fire destroys this attraction, finally freeing the spirits of the original 5 victims, though Afton's own fate remains ambiguous in the moment. Michael, having survived Ennard's possession, builds a new pizzeria specifically to lure his father out, gathering salvaged animatronics, including remnants of Baby and Ennard. Henry Emily, having fully understood his former partner's crimes by this point, orchestrates one final, deliberate fire, ending William Afton's life for good and freeing the remaining trapped spirits, including his own daughter Charlie. A quieter period follows, with Ultimate Custom Night suggesting Afton's consciousness somehow persists even after this fire, and Help Wanted introducing the first hints of Vanny and a corrupted digital remnant of Afton called Glitchtrap. Connective book material confirms this digital presence becomes entangled with a young woman named Vanessa during the construction of the massive new Mega Pizzaplex. This leads into Security Breach, where Gregory survives a night inside the Pizzaplex with help from Glamrock Freddy, while Vanessa, under Afton's lingruance as Vanny, pursues them, culminating in a confrontation with Burntrap, a physical reconstitution of Afton's remains, with the exact final outcome varying across the game's multiple endings. A year later, Ruin's investigation, led by a character ultimately revealed to be Cassidy, one of the original 5 murdered children now identified by name, deepens the mystery around Vanessa's fate while introducing a new, separate threat called the Mimic. Most recently, Into the Pit extends this universe further through time travel-adjacent storytelling, representing the current edge of confirmed canon. Several threads remain genuinely, officially unresolved as of this video. Vanessa's ultimate fate after Security Breach depends on which ending is treated as canon, and the franchise hasn't definitively settled this. The Mimic's complete origin and relationship to the Pizzaplex's broader systems remains only partially explained, and Cassidy's full history beyond her confirmed identity as Golden Freddy and her connection to the original 5 victims still has gaps the franchise hasn't filled in. Where this video has flagged something as theory rather than confirmed canon, that distinction matters, and it's worth remembering as you continue exploring this story on your own. The confirmed backbone, Afton's decades of violence, the children trapped across his creations, and Henry's eventual, devastating choice to end it through fire, is locked in. Everything built on top of that since has continued expanding outward, and based on this franchise's history, it shows no sign of stopping. That's the complete, confirmed timeline of 5 Nights at Freddy's. From a workshop friendship decades ago to a Pizzaplex ruin still being investigated today. If you want to go deeper into any single chapter of this story, the original games, the novel trilogy, and the Fazbear Frights anthology are where every detail covered here actually comes from. Let me know in the comments which part of this timeline hit you hardest, and subscribe if you want the next deep dive the moment it's out.